Good afternoon. I'm Scott Sagan, Director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation and Professor of Political Science. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Distinguished Payne lecture today on today's nuclear arms race is different. Today's speaker, Joe Hruby, served as the Undersecretary for Nuclear Security at the Department of Energy from 2021 to 2025. And prior to that, Jill had a very distinguished career in the U.S. laboratory system, culminating in the directorship of the Sandia National Laboratory. She was the Sam Nunn Distinguished Fellow at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. She's currently on the boards of Lawrence Livermore and the Atomic Weapons Establishment in the UK. She is also a member of the Anthropic National Security Advisory Committee, the National Academy Committee on International Security and Arms Control, the other CSAC, as well as many other advisory roles. She gave the Drell Lecture here at Stanford last year, and it's been wonderful having her here, not just to present this lecture today, but also to help teach one of the classes with Dr. Solgi Park this year. So thank you on behalf of all the Stanford students and the faculty who have gained so much from you. And if there are any, this is Parents Weekend, so if there are any parents in the audience, you also get to meet Jill Hruby and hear what she has to say. So please join me in welcoming Jill Hruby.
Well, thanks, Scott. It's actually been a really fun day. Spent some time at Stanford this quarter, both guest lecturing and now having the opportunity to give the Payne lecture. I would like to thank the Payne family for sponsoring this lecture series that is meant to provide an opportunity to raise public understanding on important international issues. So as Scott mentioned, today's lecture is titled, "This Nuclear Arms Race is Different." And regardless of whether nuclear weapons and arms races are in the public awareness, national security experts largely agree that a nuclear arms race is underway. All nuclear weapon states are modernizing and improving their nuclear delivery vehicles, and many are advancing their nuclear warheads, nuclear infrastructure, and growing the number of deployed weapons. This has happened before, but this time the technologies are different, and that is the focus of this talk. In 2018, Russian President Putin announced 5 new nuclear delivery vehicles, and development and testing of these oft-called exotic systems continue. Since the 2018 announcement, there has also been a US intelligence assessment that Russia is developing nuclear weapons for placement in space orbit. Additionally, Russia has updated and added more tactical nuclear weapons, short-range nuclear weapons, over the past decade. China is increasing the number of deployed nuclear weapons, testing and deploying new types of delivery vehicles, and improving its nuclear weapons infrastructure. The projection is that China will have 1,000 nuclear weapons by 2030 and is aiming to achieve numerical parity with the US and Russia after that. They are doing this with little or no international transparency or engagement. And because the US is now anticipating 2 nuclear peers for the first time, we are also rethinking our nuclear force structure, including calls to move weapons from the reserve to active deployment by once again loading intercontinental ballistic missiles with multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, so-called MIRVs, increasing the number of missiles on submarines, and buying more nuclear-capable submarines and aircraft. Other countries with smaller stockpiles include the United Kingdom and France, are increasing the number of deployed weapons, and North Korea, India, and Pakistan are advancing their testing new nuclear-capable delivery vehicles. Although these trends to increase the number of deployed weapons are troubling, in this talk I will highlight the issues beyond numbers that are not being widely recognized and that I think could change the landscape of arms racing. It's time to look holistically at the changes afoot. Before I dive in, let me say that this talk is intended to spur conversation and advance force posture and arms control thinking. It contains new thoughts, some that I'm certain will be proven wrong over time. Nonetheless, I hope to inspire thinking beyond the numbers of nuclear weapons and examine how new technologies could impact future deterrence. I want to first talk about long flight time and loitering weapons. For some time, there has been clear adversarial advancement of new nuclear-capable delivery vehicles that are less trackable, less predictable, and more maneuverable than ballistic missiles. The reason given for these new delivery systems is evasion of US missile defense. Interestingly, and a bit counterintuitively, the new systems are slower, not faster, than the weapons currently deployed. Along with being slower, these systems also have longer approach routes and therefore have the potential to be on approach for long times, or essentially to loiter. This long flight time or loitering feature is not yet much discussed in nuclear deterrence circles, so I want to discuss it here. But before outlining the loitering systems, I want to acknowledge the most prominent adversarial missile evasion development has been nuclear-capable hypersonic missiles. Russia and China have deployed hypersonic missiles for use with either conventional or nuclear warheads, and others have active development and test programs. Hypersonic missiles are harder to track and harder to intercept because they have non-ballistic trajectories. For those that don't do this stuff all the time, a ballistic trajectory is a parabola, and hypersonic missiles glide. They're harder to track because radars can't see them, and their flight paths and targets are hard to identify early. Despite their name, hypersonic missiles are not faster than ballistic missiles, although they travel quickly to targets. Nuclear hypersonic missile development, in my mind, is akin to nuclear cruise missile deployment in the 1980s. They complicate defense, enable surprise, and blur the lines between conventional and nuclear attack. However, they don't fundamentally change the nuclear deterrence calculus, although they do beg for new tracking systems. But beyond hypersonic missiles, there are several other nuclear platforms that are designed to evade missile defense that are not getting as much attention. It's my concern that these new systems, especially when taken together, may be the beginning of a trend towards loitering nuclear weapons. Therefore, it may not just be the end of predictable parabolic ballistic trajectories from hypersonic systems. It may be the beginning of a new era of nuclear weapons that deter by their ability to be ever present and strike quickly. For this talk, I'm defining loitering systems as uncrewed platforms carrying nuclear weapons that are on approach for hours, days, weeks, months, or longer, providing a constant and unpredictable nuclear threat. Many of these systems would be both hard to detect and dangerous to intercept and destroy, especially near populated areas. A true loitering system could be capable of being detonated on command or recalled once a designated deterrence mission is accomplished. This concept should become more tangible as I proceed. Systems that stay on approach for hours could more accurately be described as long flight time systems, but with additional development, they could potentially become loitering capabilities. So let me introduce the long life or loitering delivery systems that have emerged. I think there are at least 4 weapons that are under development and in test phase that have the potential to be loitering nuclear weapons. Most of these are not yet capable of staying on approach for days or longer, but they have been successfully tested for meaningfully long deployments. 3 of these are Russian systems and 1 is Chinese. There may be others, but I will use these 4 distinct types as examples. First, the Russian long flight time or loitering systems. There is one that loiters in the air, one that loiters in the ocean, and one that is space-based. Both the air and space-based systems utilize ground-based rockets for deployment, but they loiter in air or space. The air and sea loitering type systems were publicly announced by Putin, although not described as loitering systems, and are currently being tested. However, Russia has denied development of the nuclear space-based system. The air system, termed Hruby, is a nuclear-powered cruise missile, that carries nuclear weapons. The concept is that a small nuclear reactor provides the power to keep a cruise missile flying at low altitudes over long distances, avoiding traditional radar detection and maneuvering to evade missile defense. Although not a new idea, the US worked on such systems in the late 1950s and 1960s. Today, the efficacy and safety of small nuclear power reactors has improved greatly. Cruise missiles have improved, and Russia achieved a record 15-hour flight of this system less than 6 months ago in October 2025. The operational concept does not presently include the ability for the missile to return to land. So in that way, this is more of a long flight weapon intended to deploy a weapon without interception, and is not a loitering weapon aimed primarily at temporal deterrence. In tests without a weapon on board, missile flights were terminated by landing in the ocean, and then the system was recovered later after the fuel in the nuclear reactor was safe to handle. It's quite easy to conceive a landing version of this system. The Russian sea-based system, called Poseidon, has similarities to Hruby. It's a nuclear-powered underwater torpedo drone carrying a nuclear weapon. Delivered by submarine and then able to maneuver autonomously, it could stay underwater for weeks or even months. While broadly believed to be largely a high-yield coastal attack weapon, speculation abounds on options, including the ability to create tsunami-like conditions, be seeded with cobalt to cause widespread radioactive contamination, and even to be placed on the ocean floor waiting for the appropriate time to be deployed or detonated. While also not yet a deployed weapon, the Poseidon is under development, and it is conceivable it could be retrieved underwater by Russian submarine forces without a nuclear explosion, or simply left to decay. The last Russian system I will describe is a space-based nuclear weapon. Imagine a constellation of a handful of high-yield nuclear bombs in an orbit beyond low Earth orbit where most commercial satellites are positioned. The nuclear weapons could be detonated on demand and disable nearly all satellites in their line of sight from the high X-ray fields produced, thereby disrupting the civilian and defense uses of satellites such as Starlink in low Earth orbit. The government military satellites in other orbits have more radiation hardening and would not be as susceptible to harm from nuclear explosions in space. Effectively, space-based nuclear weapons could be a loitering deterrent. Although they indiscriminately destroy satellites, the US has far more satellites and is far more dependent on them than the Russian Federation. When I was in government service, the US raised concerns about these systems to other space-dependent countries to pressure the Russians to stop development of these weapons that are clearly prohibited by the existing Outer Space Treaty. China has tested one loitering type system called fractional orbital bombardment, or FOBS. FOBS uses a rocket to put a nuclear missile or missile bus in orbit so that it can re-enter the atmosphere at its chosen time and target. As the name suggests, FOBS does not remain in orbit indefinitely, but rather for a fraction of an orbit around the Earth so as not to violate the Outer Space Treaty that allows weapons of mass destruction to traverse space but not stay in orbit. Conceptually, a FOB system would loiter for hours and evade missile defense. designs of systems could easily be made to orbit longer if the Outer Space Treaty was violated. When the Chinese tested this as a very impressive capability. Okay, now that I've provided concepts of long life or loitering systems, let's discuss why they matter to nuclear deterrence. As a historical backdrop, in the 1960s, the US kept aircraft with nuclear weapons continuously in flight. There were several serious accidents that occurred during this program the program was called Chrome Dome, and thankfully did not result in a full-scale nuclear detonation. However, the accidents were serious enough to discontinue the program in 1968, after 8 years, recognizing that continuous alert raises risks that outweigh its benefits. What is different today is the long duration of loitering systems are autonomous, and furthermore have both nuclear bombs and nuclear power on board. The opportunity for and consequences of accidents are arguably higher. In today's geopolitical environment, long flight time or loitering nuclear systems could be seen to aid military objectives associated with territorial expansion. For example, if early in the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia launched a loitering system such as Burevestnik in path that flew over Europe and the United States, our support for Ukraine could have been impacted. Similarly, if China were to deploy a loitering system during a Taiwan offensive, it could change the dynamic of the conflict. Therefore, I feel it's time to heighten the attention we give to these new long life and loitering systems. Small-scale nuclear reactors combined with advances in delivery platforms and autonomy are dangerous. To avoid a nuclear accident, we should get serious about banning loitering nuclear weapons, and we should call attention to the importance of the Outer Space Treaty. These weapons are far too risky to be deployed, and the time to act is now before they're ready for widespread deployment and operational planning gets underway. Because these newer Russian and Chinese systems are overtly justified as needed to evade US missile defense, let's shift the discussion of Golden Dome. The objective of Golden Dome is to provide comprehensive missile and air defense for the United States. On the surface, it's hard to argue with that objective. It aims to expand our current limited ground and sea-based missile defense systems for mid-course and terminal interception, developed during and after the Strategic Defense Initiative program, with space sensors and space-based interceptors. Although there remain many uncertainties regarding the ultimate Golden Dome architecture, priorities have emerged. The top priority is to create a command and control system for the program. That makes sense, since Golden Dome envisions a vast and intricate network of space-based assets, ground infrastructure, and existing land and sea-based defense systems operating in concert. The next Golden Dome priorities are space-based sensors and space-based interceptors. The space-based sensors will likely be new and extended constellations of satellites outfitted with different sensor types to track any incoming weapon and aid in targeting. Advancements in both sensors and AI make space-based sensor layers a technology whose time has come. The new space-based interceptors target pre-launch, boost, and early mid-course phases, since there are limited or no capability today for that. Fast pre-launch destruction provides a clear advantage, although it is potentially very provocative. Boost and early phase interception is desirable because missiles are slower and easier to track, and decoys are not yet deployed in those early phases. However, a significant challenge for interception at those phases involves having the interceptors in the right place at the right time, perhaps requiring many thousands of interceptors in orbit. These types of technologies need to be matured. For Golden Dome to challenge the mutual vulnerability of nuclear weapons, there is much work to be done. For example, since Russia has more than 1,000 strategic nuclear weapons, we would need to detect and intercept at a very high efficiency in order not to be vulnerable to massive damage if they deployed a significant fraction of their weapons against us. However, it is almost certain that Russia will be concerned about our capabilities advancing over time and will likely react immediately. Therefore, it's arguable that space-based nuclear weapons could be seen by them as a method to disable missile defenses. But it seems certain that their response will also likely include adding more nuclear weapons to their existing arsenals with more decoys, especially with the expiration of New START earlier this month. I present these thoughts to encourage analysis of the impacts of Golden Dome on nuclear deterrence. This type of analysis is needed as soon as possible to design an architecture that does what President Trump has stated: forever end the missile threat to the homeland, without spurring a nuclear arms race with new technologies that could spiral out of control. If this analysis is done early and kept current, there may be technological solutions that could alleviate concerns about the dissolution of mutual vulnerability. There are two additional issues today concerning nuclear weapons in the public domain. One is Iran, and one is nuclear testing. Since the Iran negotiations are just getting underway, I won't make any predictions at this point. But if you want to discuss that in Q&A, we certainly could. However, I would like to address the issue of resuming nuclear testing. On October 29th, President Trump instructed the Department of War to resume nuclear testing, quote, on an equal basis to Russia and China. For months, there has been confusion about the intent of this statement. However, over the past few weeks, several administration officials have begun to elaborate. On February 6th, at the Conference on Disarmament, Thomas DiNanno, the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, made clear that President Trump was referring to conducting small supercritical nuclear weapon tests of the type that Russia was previously alleged to have conducted, and DiNanno disclosed information in his speech to implicate China for conducting similar small-scale nuclear tests in 2020. Since then, Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control and Nonproliferation, Christopher Yaw, has provided a speech at the Hudson Institute and made statements at the Conference of Disarmament earlier this week that continue to provide evidence that these tests in the tens of tons yield range are the type of test President Trump was referring to when he said on an equal basis. There are still statements concerning the potential for a somewhat larger supercritical test that were intentionally obfuscated by China through a method called decoupling, but that has not become the center of the disclosure. To quickly put this in perspective, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, prohibits any nuclear tests that produce yield, the so-called zero yield standard. The US has interpreted zero yield to mean any test that produces a nuclear chain reaction, although there is no internationally accepted definition. Therefore, the US has abided by the CTBT by conducting only subcritical tests that do not result in a chain reaction. The tests that Russia and now China have alleged to have conducted produce a chain reaction but limit the yield to about 10 tons. As a comparison, the atomic bombs used in Japan had yields of about 15 or 20 tons, and most of the US arsenal is over 100 kilotons. For years, US nuclear weapon design labs, Los Alamos, Sandia, and Livermore, have said that there were no technical reasons to resume nuclear testing at this time. The US replaced testing with science programs, sophisticated laboratory experiments, and subcritical testing. Congress has mandated that the National Nuclear Security Administration, the organization that actually conducts nuclear testing, not the Department of War, to be prepared to resume testing in 24 to 36 months if the need arises. Subcritical testing is a non-controversial way to maintain a certain level of test readiness and also to produce meaningful experimental results without violation of CTBT. It's still hard to know what the Trump administration is aiming to do with the statements about test resumption. On the one hand, if the US conducted such tests, it would be expensive, marginally increase test readiness, and if well-designed and instrumented, could produce data that is hard to otherwise collect. However, it would be an open invitation to others around the world to conduct similar tests, thereby undermining the CTBT and potentially leading to proliferation and new weapon design, the concerns that CTBT was designed to abate. Given the recent statements made by US officials, it could also be the case that the disclosure of small-scale supercritical testing by Russia and China are being used as levers to try to get China and Russia to the negotiating table on nuclear issues, which has been difficult. However, the bottom line is that information concerning small supercritical testing by Russia and China points to, as a minimum, a lack of transparency about adherence to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It does not, however, mean that the US should conduct similar tests, since we have invested in sophisticated experimental and modeling approaches that help us ensure our stockpile reliability without such tests. Additionally, the subcritical tests we performed are aimed to explore issues of the most importance to us. Therefore, it is my judgment that testing is an area where the US can afford to maintain the strictest interpretation of zero yield and insist that others do so as well. In closing, for decades, the United States has consistently maintained discipline and restraint on our nuclear weapons, abided by treaties, including New START and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban, and worked towards reducing the reliance on nuclear arsenals. However, geopolitical goals and US missile defense programs in the past and aspirations for the future have provided reasons for our adversaries to develop new types of weapon delivery vehicles using modern technologies. These new delivery vehicles are in many cases inherently more dangerous than the weapons in the current triads. We find ourselves in an awkward position where we need more capable missile defense to defend ourselves from systems designed to overcome our missile defense. It is my opinion that we need increased attention on adversarial development of autonomous and long life and loitering nuclear weapon systems. We should reinforce the Outer Space Treaty. We should work to understand the impact of the Golden Dome program on nuclear deterrence. Furthermore, we should not incite weapon testing and development by returning to test. Many argue that the way back to peace is through strength. This approach has been effective in the past. But meanwhile, we should recognize that this arms race is different because geopolitical goals are different and because technology is once again making new weapons possible. It's time to think holistically about nuclear weapons and arms racing and stop being overly focused on the number of nuclear weapons and providing a shield for their use. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. I'm going to ask a question or two, and then I'm going to turn it to the audience. For people online, if you could ask your question in the Q&A function. We'll have cards passed up here. And I'm going to ask people when they ask their question, try to keep it to one question and have a question mark at the end. It's no fair saying I'm going to ask a three-part question because that's three questions. And secondly, please identify yourself and what your affiliation is. But I'm going to start, Joe. You asked us to, in the spirit of this is to provoke additional thought and dialogue to think about some of the things you're raising that are probing and at least to me create these kinds of fuss. I was very pleased that you mentioned not just Golden Dome and Iron Dome, which we read a lot about, but also Chrome Dome, the American Airborne Alert Program. And you pointed out that there were lots of accidents. We dropped a bomb in South Carolina that or is still down there somewhere. We dropped bombs in when a B-52 exploded over Spain. We dropped bombs in the Mediterranean and in Spain in '66. And we've been reminded because of the issues about Greenland that in 1968, a B-52 crew abandoned a Chrome Dome B-52 on alert when a fire broke out inside the plane, aimed it at the American base, Thule, Greenland, but the plane, without any pilot in it, they had abandoned it, flew over the aircraft, flew over the base, and the 4 thermonuclear weapons did not explode because of their safety systems, but did explode conventionally and spread plutonium all over the area, something that Greenlanders and the Danish who cleaned it up thoroughly remember.
I remember, yeah.
So I think it's great that you're raising these questions of accidents. Should we also be thinking about questions of false warnings? Because the danger in Thule, Greenland, I would argue, is not just an accident, it's that had the weapon gone off, we would have thought they were attacking Thule.
Yeah.
And the problem in the Cuban Missile Crisis, famously, was when we went on a high level of alert, the U-2s, which were not for intelligence operations about what the Soviets were doing in terms of their missile forces or bomber forces, they were trying to find out if there was debris in the air from their testing program. One of them flew into the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev, knowing that we had airborne alert, said, Mr. Kennedy, don't you know that this could have been seen as a B-52? So when you think about this loitering question, you're raising lots of really interesting questions. How should we go about researching this and understanding these risks? What kind of analysis can we do, and who should be doing it?
Yeah.
Help us with that. And please raise your hands. I'll try to take some questions.
Okay. Well, I'm as most of you know, Scott's an expert in nuclear accidents, and I'm an expert in nuclear security systems. So we approach the problem like from slightly different angles. But I do think accidents are signaling is an issue, and we should think about signaling. But even if it wasn't, we need to think about this. So I felt that it was just like it was piling on to say that it's actually worse, but it is actually worse. And I do think like everything that I said today is open literature stuff. Obviously, I wouldn't say it otherwise. And so I think there are ways for people to start studying what could go wrong. And part of this is trying to understand how the Russians and Chinese have thought about this problem and what they're doing in terms of nuclear reactor design and nuclear weapon design that makes them believe that the risk that, yeah.
And does this come up in your National Academy of Sciences meetings with the Russians and the Chinese?
You know, I haven't participated since I was out of office in the Russian dialogue, but I know Jim Timby is here, who leads that dialogue, or saw him earlier. And I think
here.
Rose,
Are you in the back somewhere? Yeah,
right
there
here
in the front.
So I don't.
But if you say anything about whether you can talk to the Russians or Chinese about this, it would be great. Yes? Well, I think she's asking you. Is that something
you can make
National
a comment,
Academy?
or Rose if she's.
Rose is here too. Yeah.
Right.
Jim, introduce yourself for people in the audience, and I think this is a good example of dialogues that we need to have. So,
I'm Jim Timmy. I'm a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution across the street.
longstanding senior State Department and other U.S. government positions in arms control.
Your question is about what we talk about with the Russians in our track 2.
Which is, can you talk about questions of loitering systems, potentials for false warnings and accidents, and how can they be confident that they won't have them with these exact systems?
We could, I mean, those are the sorts of subjects that we talk about. We have not actually engaged on any of these issues except for the weapon in orbit, which is so obvious. We reminded them that it's not consistent with the
outer space.
But the sorts of things that Joe is outlining here are the sorts of things that we could discuss in track 2 discussions.
I have Rose Gottemuller.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you, Joe, for a wonderful speech. Very, very thought-provoking. One quick comment, which is, have been discussing the notion of a FOBS ban and also a ban on nuclear weapons in orbit. Essentially, that one would be to reemphasize the ban in the Outer Space Treaty. But, and in track 2 settings with the Chinese and the Russians, not necessarily the CFAC one, but we're going to discuss the experience so far. So that's just a quick comment. My question to you is, part of this, I think, the glamour of reopening the testing issue has to do with a long-standing discomfiture with the science-based stockpile stewardship program. But yet I see all kinds of new technologies coming down the road that would bolster science-based stockpile stewardship, among them artificial intelligence, of course, that's everybody's favorite, but also perhaps some quantum technologies can be here. Would you comment on how you see the role of new technologies in the next phase of science-based stockpile stewardship?
Well, if you all might advocate for science-based stockpile stewardship as a long-time laboratory person, and more recently trying to assure the long-term safety, security, and reliability of our stockpile. Look, because the science-based stewardship has been reasonably well funded, has had clear objectives, and is done by premier institutions, new technologies are introduced all the time. I mean, that program has driven, computer architectures. The fastest computer in the world, at least momentarily, is at Lawrence Livermore. The NIF facility, achieved first ever laboratory-based fusion. So that program uses exceptional science with clear definition of what needs to be done, and the people who, in my experience, the people who have not supported that program as being enough are people who haven't spent enough time understanding that program, and that's hard because a lot of it's classified. So it's just a dialogue that we'll always have to have. I would just say on testing, people who formally tested cannot believe we're not testing. I mean, that's just a cultural thing. And it has always been a debate. That debate has never gone away, but for a long time, it's been clear that we really don't need to, and it's it has a set of consequences, international consequences, that are not in our favor. And so But there'll always be the debate among scientists and engineers. And like personally, I welcome that debate, but I don't welcome a debate that because Russia and China have done these things, we need to too. That's just, I think it's a different question.
Tom Dannenbaum next.
Thanks very much. It's really fascinating.
Wait for the mic 1 second.
Thank you, Tom Dannenbaum, member of the faculty here. This was a fascinating lecture. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the ideas regarding seeking to limit loitering, long life, and autonomous weapon systems in this context in two respects. First of all, the degree to which it's possible to negotiate limitations on those specific to the nuclear domain at the same time as we're seeing significant advances and desire for advances with respect to those capabilities in the non-nuclear domain, including from the United States. And the second is with respect to how the United States negotiates with Russia and China on these issues, what kind of concessions the United States would be offering that would be sufficient to motivate Russia and China to potentially see this as valuable for them? Is it exclusively that the concessions would be in like for like, that the United States is developing similar kinds of capabilities with nuclear implications, and conceding the ability to do that would be sufficient to motivate Russia and China? Or would there need to be a concession on a different dimension to weigh against the strategic benefits that Russia and China see from these developments? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I mean, I would say, I know that the convention for certain types of conventional weapons at the UN have been dealing with restrictions on loitering and autonomous systems, lethal autonomous weapon systems. And they've struggled with that, in part because the US has not supported any restrictions. I do think that the nuclear case is easier to make than the conventional case on the danger associated, the risk associated with these systems. So it could be a way to help that dialogue along, but it could be a major distraction. And, I'm not sure which it would be. In terms of leverage, to try to discuss with these systems and arms control in general with Russia and China, we're not developing these types of systems. There's, in the plan, public plan for the U.S. stockpile, there aren't systems of this type. And at this point, the consensus has been, we feel confident in our current systems, but we're also not seeing the development of missile defense by, Russia and China in the same way that we're doing that, right? So exactly the tit for tat there and what gets put on the table will depend an awful lot on, who's at the table and what they're willing to put. But so I think, look, as much I get as mad at Russia as anybody else but I will say that in general they've been a responsible nuclear weapon state. Like they haven't done crazy things, but this is starting to look a little crazy. And so I think we have to appeal to the sensibilities and make strong cases and be willing to put something on the table, whatever that may be. And I'm not in a position to say what that could be right now. But unless we think about that, we won't start it. And my concern is if you listen to the dialogue now, we're concerned about two nuclear peers, and we're concerning about having a large enough number of weapons to deter both. And there may be more to the discussion than that.
I'm going to take two questions from the online group, both related to testing. And then I've got Steve Pfeiffer and gentleman here in the front coming up next. Two questions on testing. One, What is your view on what Russia and China believe they are gaining by the tests that the administration has accused them of doing? And second, when you talk about the global consequences of a potential end of the CTBT, are you concerned about India and Pakistan, or are you concerned about new nuclear states emerging, and what are those global consequences to which you refer?
Okay, great questions. So Russia and China, it may be different what they're getting from them. So Russia, like the United States, has a lot of data from atmospheric and underground nuclear testing. They are likely concerned about aging of nuclear materials as we are. And they haven't invested the same amount of money in the laboratory-based experiments and other experiments that we have. And frankly, they don't have the compute power that we have. So it's more straightforward to imagine that they have specific concerns that they're looking at. They may well be aging concerns, but it's not inconceivable that they're interested in effects. For example, the nuclear weapon in space, they really want to produce X-rays. So they may be sort of they could be fine-tuning some things around that, right? So China, on the other hand, has a very limited number of nuclear tests before the CTBT. And so their nuclear weapons are not nearly as fine-tuned as ours. Their weapon lifetimes are much shorter than our weapon lifetimes. So there's room for improvement in their designs to get longer lives. And if they can get longer life weapons, then they can build their stockpile faster, because they're spending part of their production capacity replacing
It's
weapons.
not a yield question, it's a longevity
It
question.
might be right. Like, let's get right. So that's a possibility. This is all subjecture. I mean, we don't know that information. But my concern about the global concerns. So North Korea, it comes first to mind because, of course, they've tested some already, and I'm sure we'd like to get additional data from testing. And we know they have the capability to do that at their test site. So it would seem that they would be fast followers. India and Pakistan are complicated because I have mixed feelings. Part of what we did and the Russians did in our testing program were design safe weapons, 1-point safe weapons, all this stuff. India and Pakistan didn't have the time to do that in their testing program. So maybe they would want to test 1-point safety and other, that could actually be beneficial in its own way.
Although it might encourage them to deploy the weapons.
Yes, that's right. Like everything in this this area has its pluses and minuses. But, the US and Russia have large test databases. Other countries don't, that currently have nuclear weapons. And then there's the possibility of countries that are nascent nuclear weapon states that want to acquire nuclear weapons, or potentially might want to acquire nuclear weapons in the future, could feel like they could test.
Another question about the Golden Dome program. Many analysts have concluded that it's not feasible and that it would cost more than it was worth. Can you comment on thinking about both feasibility, but also, the term's not used here, but people used to talk about cost effectiveness at the margin, that is the price of interceptors versus the price of
Defense and offense.
defensive and offense. And what's your thinking on that? And what other research could be done to help us think through these things?
Yeah, well, we don't. What we know is that Golden Dome will be will cost a lot of money to develop and deploy, and it will need to be iterated. There is no question about that. But look, we pay a lot of money for defense in this country, right? Already. And so, you know, if the administration decides that this is our best, you know, this is absolutely essential for security of the United States, then I think that there will be, you know, money spent. Now, look, in the past, what's happened is we never got a shield, but we got capabilities that exist today in terms of
Capabilities against the North Koreans, perhaps, or against
limited, you know, limited numbers, limited threats, only in terminal phase and some mid-course phases, right? Very limited, but it's a hard problem, and we've made a lot of progress on it, right? And so there's no question that we'll make progress on this if we spend a lot of money doing it. And as I said, you know, space sensors, pretty, you know, well developed. I mean, it'll be complicated to put it all into place and coordinated. Interceptors are another thing altogether. And that's where I think it gets really tricky. And that's where I think the discussion of whether we can sustain, maintain mutual vulnerability and things come into place about how can we limit interceptors and intercept technology that doesn't completely change the calculus of nuclear deterrence.
You know, a number of us received some briefings on the Israeli defense in the June war, and it was striking how, from the Western perspective, from the U.S. at least, we just thought how effective it was. Shockingly effective, 86% against missiles, and even higher against cruise missiles. But what the preview was telling us was how there was still a lot of offense-defense interaction, that the Israelis were running out of, especially arrow systems, I believe, and had to really make some calculations about which incoming missiles do we shoot down and which ones do we let go because we think they're not going to hit the target. That is a tough real-time call, right? And I had not recognized how effective some of the Israeli attacks against missile systems were, which couldn't kill them all on the ground, that is preemptive attacks, but stopped the salvo attacks, which was one way of increasing effectiveness. So I think there are all sorts of offense-defense interactions that we've stopped studying and that we need to think through much more effectively in the future, because we're walking into a new world that we haven't recognized very. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's really important. Steve Pfeiffer in the back, introduce yourself.
Yeah, Steve Pfeiffer. I'm an affiliate here with CSAC. Jill, thanks for a really interesting discussion. But let me push a little bit on the two Russian systems, the Burevestnik and the Poseidon, because I'm still kind of trying to wonder from a military point of view why we should worry that much. I mean, Burevestnik presumably is launched from the ground in Russia. It takes hours to reach its target. And if the Russians were trying to sort of deploy those before they launched ballistic missiles, presumably they'd be launching enough that we would detect something so we would know it was coming. And then with Poseidon, again, if it's going to be launched from a mothership somewhere north of the Kola Peninsula, it's 15, 20 hours to reach the East Coast. So I'm not sure that's usable, certainly in a military way, early in the war. And in fact, if the Poseidon does carry a 1 or 2 megaton warhead, generates a nuclear tsunami, presumably that's only really good for attacking a large urban area, which to my mind, one of its effects would be is to reduce or remove the inhibitions, whatever the American president had about striking Russian cities. So could you talk a little bit about the military effects? Because these weapons really do seem to be kind of, you know, it's all over, we're going to make sure that you pay type weapons.
Yeah. Steve, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think this is the problem, that we've at some level dismissed them for this reason. But The point of Burevestnik, from my perspective, what I'm trying to raise is perhaps it is not a missile defense, exclusively a missile evasion system, missile defense evasion system. Perhaps it is, if it like truly loiters, it's a system for territorial acquisition, right? So we know President Putin has ambitions to take back territory that was the former Soviet Union. It's been difficult in Ukraine. But if he has this long life cruise missile that he can launch, that is circling the globe while he is conducting an offensive territorial grab somewhere, will it change the dynamic or this possibility of success of that? And could it just return? That is, could it be a temporal threat? And I don't know what their war plans are, but I think they've spent a bunch of money doing this. Russia doesn't do that unless there's a reason. That's my observation. So I'm trying to figure out what is the reason. And missile defense just isn't good enough from my perspective. Now, Poseidon is a different issue, and is, in my opinion, a bit more complicated. I think it could be a coastal population center weapon. It could be a submarine-based weapon. It could be a coastal submarine base, or Navy bases that are all on coast, right? I mean, there's a lot of assets there. So it may be a population weapon. It may be a military weapon, a base weapon. But they would have to tell us they launched it, probably, right? It's not as clear that, I mean, we would see a cruise missile. Not so clear we would see Poseidon, or how we would see Poseidon, whether they would want us to know, whether they would not want us to know. But its military purpose seems, more obvious. But it also seems like it could just sort of sit around and wait. And that's kind of scary. Because we know that, the Russian submarine forces aren't nearly as capable as ours. I hope that answered your questions.
Leo K. From Lawrence Livermore Research Associate. I thought that was a really excellent point that you made about focusing more on the technology than the numbers. I just wanted to develop it from a sort of slightly different perspective. That is to say, competitive strategies. So, I mean, you did an excellent job of outlining the threat environment, loitering munitions, etc. But so, what my question is essentially, in what technological fields do you think the United States and her allies may possess an asymmetric strategic advantage? And in what ways could they potentially operationalize that into capabilities, which would then provide them with some kind of a leverage? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And that's what, and we need to, I'll answer the question. I'll give a very incomplete answer to this question. I mean, unfortunately, from my perspective, one way is space-based sensor layers. I mean, like our AI capabilities and our ability to launch things into space and keep things into space is way better, right? So that's a clear advantage. So it's not surprising that we want to do it. But when I was, in the Biden administration, I felt, and I still feel like we aren't, we want to believe that if we maintain the triad, modernize it, that we have everything we need. And we might. I don't know that we don't, like, we might. But that doesn't mean that's how other people are thinking, right? And so I think this is, we need to understand why. I mean, it is unquestionable that these systems are being developed. We need to understand why. And then we need to understand what we need to do about it. But we've dismissed the fact, I mean, we've not entirely dismissed, but we easily dismiss this isn't important. You know, we just easily say that. And are we sure?
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. My name is Svetlana Khutka. I'm visiting scholar at UC Berkeley, and in past visiting scholar and professor here at Stanford as Fulbright scholar. I'm from Ukraine, and well, we had Reshniks, we had Zircons, all the stuff on our territory as our New Year gifts. We had a lot of memes and jokes about that, but still it's very sad because Ukraine has become a testing ground demonstrating the collapse of the old world order and the dominance of power. So drones are also there. Burevestnik is technically flying Chernobyl, and a new start is over, etc., etc. So speaking about the global nuclear security, where are the key checker points of the colliding interests, military interests, as we have seen it at the Ukrainian territory, colliding interests for Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran today, in your opinion? Thank you.
Well, well, thank you. And we spoke a little bit before the event today about how complicated the Ukrainian situation continues to be after such a long time. And it's wonderful to have you here. I think there are collaborations among this set of countries, maybe bilateral, maybe multilateral, maybe multilaterals, you know, like, but they're being careful to keep those to things that we can't, that don't produce like something we see. Dr. Parks and I had this discussion yesterday, thinking about changes in the North Korean program that, you know, might be attributable on very technical things like the materials they seem to have access to and things like that, that might be by these allies. So that's a very relevant question. And I personally do believe there are things happening, but not that we can readily see. But the community needs to pay attention to that as well.
I have two more from the online, and then I have Kevin Bustamante and Isabel Porteous next on the group here. But let me take two. One I think will be a short answer, and one will be, I think, a longer answer. First question is, can you say something about reports that the Israelis are constructing a new reactor, and why might they be doing that? And second, can you say something about the way the Trump administration makes decisions in the areas of missile defense and or testing?
Well, they may both be yes and no questions. So well, I'm not going to comment about Israel. On the Trump administration decisions, I would like, okay, they say confusing things. But at least in the case of nuclear testing, they have tried to come back and clarify. which I appreciate. We still don't know why they said the confusing things, and they're still somewhat confusing. And I get a kick out of this on an equal basis thing. Is that so not Trump? Like, would Trump ever say on an equal basis? Like, from my perspective, like somebody fed him
Someone
that
planted that
line.
idea.
And so he's clearly listening to somebody, and they clearly have something going on here, and they're filling it out, and they're starting to make public statements about it. So maybe we'll learn more. They haven't done a nuclear posture review. Their national defense strategy says very, very little about anything nuclear. So, I mean, I'm not on the inside, so I certainly talk to people, but I think we're still waiting to see exactly on the nuclear issues what Trump really thinks. We know he cares about nuclear weapons, like we know he doesn't like them, but there's not any kind of master strategy that can be garnered, that at least I can garner from what's publicly available, and in limited discussions with people in this administration.
Well, you refer to it as filling in. This is what the president meant, or this is how to interpret it. But bureaucratic politics come into play both before an announcement is made, or if a not well thought through announcement is made, then the bureaucratic politics plays as well. From someone who spent so much time in the lab system, how do you see this playing out? Are the labs having the same influence that they've had in the past, or are you concerned about their independence and their ability to do what they need to do and what they've done so well in the past?
Yeah. Well, I think the labs still have influence. I think the labs have, obviously been part of the discussion of nuclear tests. They would be the best to comment on what you would be able to get from a nuclear test, what it might cost, how long it might take, why you need to do it or not do it. They're not the people who would decide whether or not it was worth it. They never have been, right? But I am confident that they are involved in the discussion. I am also confident that they have an independent voice. So I think they're playing the same role that they have, but the administration, look, a lot of the nuclear officials are really just getting in place in this administration. There were a lot of end of the year sort of confirmations. And so that group, and then Trump has given them a lot to work on, right? There's Iran, there's this testing issue,
Golden Dome.
Golden Dome. And so their plate is full. They're new. They're working in a new environment. We will see more in the next year, but we're not getting it from written documents.
Evan Bustamante in the back.
Jill, this is a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Speak up, and let's make sure.
Ken Bustamante, I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. And what I want to contribute towards is the spirit of this conversation regarding, thinking through what we need in strategic thought and these new technologies. And this is going back to Steve Pfeiffer's point a little bit, which is, how should we think about, these new political dynamics with these new technological developments? So for me, I'm thinking through, like, why should we think that a loiter system might be used before territorial expansion? Like, wouldn't that constitute its own sort of massive escalation that we wouldn't necessarily see even today? So, like, why would it be so different, I suppose?
Okay, I had a hard time hearing you, but I'll address the question I think you asked. I will go back to some comments I made earlier. These systems are very impressive and hard to develop. Like a 15-hour cruise missile is no small feat, right? Small nuclear reactors to power it is no small feat. So all of this work is being done. I mean, I think it was six, nuclear professionals were killed in one of the tests of the system, and they continue to test it, and they achieve different results, right, and better results. So they care about this. So the challenge, Kevin, to us, and these are the kinds of things I know you like to think about, is why, and I'm putting forward at least a one possible reason, or maybe several possible reasons why. But we all need to think about that. I welcome the discussion, that other people's ideas about why.
I would just note that when we're talking about how we make decisions, we're talking about bureaucratic politics, president who might make something based on who we talk to last without the full interagency process. It is said that tendency to want to ask why and explain it by rational interests is so strong when you see somebody else doing something, that the Austrian great diplomat Metternich asked his staff once, when the ambassador from another country died, he said, "Tell me why he did that." And it seems to me that when you're thinking about why the Russians or Chinese are testing this, that they've got their own bureaucratic politics, and they've got their own sense that we've got to do something splashy because the leader wants us to do something splashy. And I don't think we know that much about that. Or
it's possible, Scott, that the scientists have convinced Putin that this is so cool that it will reflect very positively on Russian scientific capabilities, that it'll be a deterrent and we should do it, even though there's no military use. That's impossible, but that is kind of awfully comfortable for us to think that's the reason.
Yeah. Fair point. Isabel.
Jill, this has been fantastic. Thank you for being here. I'm Isabel. I'm an alumni of the CSAC Honors Program, and I work on national security and commercial space projects. And sticking with the theme of why here, the question of why with the orbiting nuclear weapon has a lot to do with a threat on other space systems. I'm curious about the dynamics of why, given that they know we know they have it now. Mm-hmm. This isn't something that we would have. This is something that could have been done discreetly in certain orbits. I also want to say that with modern space technology, it's easier and easier to see what's going on up there. And that includes on-site inspections that become possible in the space domain with proximity operations and nuclear material sensors and things like that. So you brought up the question of strengthening the Outer Space Treaty. I wonder what that looks like in your eyes. What would it mean to strengthen the Outer Space Treaty? Is it monitoring? And also, is the why for the space weapon different now?
Yeah. Well, I believe the Outer Space Treaty came in, it was a 1967-ish treaty, so it's pretty old. Most people weren't paying attention to it. So the first thing is just to re-educate the community about what is allowed and not allowed by the Outer Space Treaty. And it's a solid set of things that are allowed and not allowed, especially for a treaty that is not that old. Monitoring is always a good place, right? And as you mentioned, there are new ways to monitor that certainly were not available at that time. So that would be a way. One way to strengthen it, and another would, do case, have international dialogue around case studies. Is this or is this not, because look, there are people in the United States who don't like Golden Dome, who say it violates the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty. That just undermines the outer space. I don't think it violates, exactly the spirit of it, but it doesn't matter if it violates the spirit in a way, because the treaty is very specific, as treaties are. And so I think it's just It should be part of the international dialogue. It should be clear that a nuclear weapon in space by anybody violates it, and perhaps it needs new monitoring. And maybe the space community is really vibrant. Like maybe you guys can think of new things that we could do to strengthen that treaty. Thank you.
I have Sitara Noor and then the gentleman raising his hand with the paper afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill, for a very fascinating talk. I'm Sitara Noor, postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. With all the discussion about, the developments in the new armament, all developments, weapons in the space, and potential resumption of testing across the world, where do you see the future of arms control agreements or the risk reduction measures going forward? Do you think would it still remain in the numbers like the START agreements, or should it be focused more on the geographical terms, like should not be placed here in space or limiting that area, or the technology? Where do you think it's most needed? And is there in any of these dimensions, where is the more potential of it going forward?
Right. Well, I'm afraid the answer is a little bit all of the above. Numbers will always be important. They do provide a level of stability and predictability. So I don't want to just say numbers were always silly. That was a good approach, and it remains a good approach. So numbers are relevant, but we also have to talk about how we also have to introduce some technologies. I mean, loitering nuclear weapons powered by, nuclear power is just like, can we talk about that? Can we just, I mean, it seems we can't ignore it. If in fact these things are getting close to deployment, which Putin says they are, don't know if that's true or not. So I think we have to talk about technology. I think we have to talk about numbers. Multilateral treaties would be great, but I think bilateral treaties also still offer something. So I think we should keep our eye on opportunities for bilateral treaties and not just say, well, they're no good because there's all these other players. So I think we can't, and not to mention the fact that we can't talk. Like we've lost our ability at a diplomatic level to have meaningful conversations. So we have to get that restarted. And it's easy to say, and it's very hard to do. And it's not just a Trump administration thing. We had problems in the Biden administration with that as well. So if there are topics that can bring people to the table, we ought to talk about them.
Good afternoon, John Marienthal. I'm just a person from the public. I had a question relating to testing, and I wrote it. Does the search for lowest yield weapons decrease the threshold for using nuclear weapons? So, for example, if somebody comes up with a 80-ton bomb that could wipe out an airfield, there might be a temptation to use that as a tactical nuclear weapon.
Yeah. Well, this is a highly debated topic in the community. Or small yield, what are will tactical nuclear weapons or small yield weapons mean they're more likely to be used? And the general feeling is, I mean, I would say yes. That's the general feeling is, but these tests are still way below the yields of these tests are still way below credible tactical nuclear weapons. So it's unlikely that they're actually designing a 10-ton weapon, but it is likely they could learn things at that yield that would be relevant to small yield weapons as well as other types of weapons.
What could you say about the lowest yields in the U.S. arsenal and the debates within the labs and governments and scholarly community about whether that's stabilizing because it makes it more likely that we respond to a Russian tactical use, or destabilizing because it makes it more likely that we would do this first?
I would say that low yield nuclear weapons introduced into the US stockpile are meant for deterrence. Like that, not to win a war. They're meant to be more effective deterrent. Like that is the thought process. That
Walk the audience through the logic of that, though.
Okay.
Jill, I mean, you were involved in some big decisions in this area, and I want to hear your side of the argument.
Yeah, well, there is an overwhelming. Well, so Russia has more tactical nuclear weapons than we do. They have more tactical nuclear weapons than we do because their environment is quite different, right? They've got people. They've got battles to fight nearer to them than we have. But the probability or the temptation of using one of these weapons, because it's less horrible, we want to avoid, like we want to deter. And we feel like if the thought process is Russia may not believe that we would respond with 100 kiloton weapon if they used I don't know, we debate the number, but a much smaller weapon, right? A battlefield weapon. So the sense is that to deter that use, we need low yield weapons so that they would believe we would use them in response. I don't think that there's it doesn't, like just as logically, if deterrence fails and we need to prevail, low yield weapons are not that useful. Right? So by definition, they're more of a deterrent. Now, we think low yield weapons have the potential to be used more easily by the Russians, but we don't really translate that directly to any warfighting plan that we have.
So we have one last question from the online group, but it will tee you up for making some final comments about being back in a university setting and what you're doing, because someone who's clearly a student said, thank you for your inspiring comments. I'm inspired, but I'm worried about what jobs I'm going to get in the future, which is a common phenomenon. And you've been seeing what's happened in the labs, you're spending time at the university, you've seen what happened with DOE and DOGE, et cetera. So what do you say to this student? But more broadly, can you comment about your experience, helping teach this class with Dr. Park, and just observations of students and graduate students today, and what advice you have for them?
Yeah, this is not a new phenomena. Students want to get jobs. But in teaching, in guest lecturing in Dr. Park's class, my objective, like being immersed in it, has really been to inspire people to work on these really hard national security issues. From a technology perspective, if that's where they come from, or from a policy perspective, a governance perspective, like we are so far behind in governing new technologies compared to the pace of their development that it is a huge challenge that this generation has to feel prepared to tackle. And so I think this is an incredibly interesting time to enter the workforce, because the technologies are going, gangbusters. All kinds of good things are happening, and some not so good things are happening. And to govern those technologies in a way that allows most of all the good things to happen and none or almost none of the bad things to happen is like, wow. I mean, that's something you could do for the next 50 years, right, in your life. And so I think that's a super exciting time for people to understand the opportunities to work in technology development, work in governance of technology development, and frankly, the need to deeply understand both. It's a very challenging environment. And so people often ask, engineers and scientists often ask me how to get involved in policy, and policy people often ask me how to get involved in technology. And there's one common part of that answer is, immerse yourself in it. And know when you know enough to do the other part well, right? So I think it's a super exciting time for students, and my intent here was to help people understand like how exciting, how many opportunities, and how badly we need smart, highly trained people to work on these problems.
Well, thank you on behalf of the university for sharing your ideas with so many students this quarter and in the lecture last quarter. It just remains for the audience to join me in thanking you for this lecture today.